In the long and no doubt illustrious C# coding career that lies before you, you are going to have to deal with compiler issues and bugs. And that's what we're going to talk about in this section, debugging. And we're going to start off with dealing with common compilation issues. Now, many of these are fairly common and they tend to trip up new C# developers. Don't feel bad if this happens to you. I personally assure you that I myself have committed every single one of the issues I'm about to show you. So I've got my compile issues sample project open, and what I'm going to do is walk through each one of these issues and show you why each one is a problem. So I'm going to start with issue number 1. Let me uncomment this line of code, and we'll save, and we've got a problem. In fact, let me hit the F6 button to try to build so we can see what the problem exactly is. And I'll scroll that code into view, and we can see here down in the error list, it says, there's a semicolon expected. Well, a semicolon is expected at the end of every line of C# code. If you're coming from a language like JavaScript where semicolons are optional, you need to realize that in C# that's not the case. You do have to have a semicolon that terminates every single one of your statements. Double click on the error and it takes us right to that point in the code. We can put in our semicolon and save, and then we can build, and now everything is all right again. Now we're getting a bit of a warning here that says that the myString variable is assigned, but it's never used. But let's just ignore that for the moment. Go down to issue number 2. So issue number 2, I'm going to uncomment this line of code. And once again, we get a whole bunch of errors. Sometimes it's tempting to try to look for the error that's the simplest to fix and try to fix it that way. In fact, if you look in the error list, you'll see that there's a bunch of errors. One of them says semicolon expected. One of them says parentheses expected. So you might be tempted to just jump to that line and try to put a semicolon in to fix things. That's actually the wrong thing to do here. What I suggest you do is start with the topmost error, because sometimes when you fix the topmost error, that will fix all the errors below it. And if you look really closely at this line, you'll notice that the problem is that I didn't close off the string using double quotes. And sure enough, once I do that, all the other errors go away. Before you try to figure out which is the easiest problem to solve, try to figure out what the actual error is, because now you can see that the compiler is saying, oh yeah, there's the semicolon, and oh yeah, there's the parentheses. It just couldn't see them before because it thought they were part of the string hello world. In the next issue, I'm going to use an array list. If you watch the section on collections, you know what array lists are. They are a type of collection that work like an array. I'm going to uncomment this line, and sure enough, we've got problems. If we look in the error list, it says the type or namespace name array list could not be found. Are you missing a using directive or an assembly reference? That's just a very long-winded way of the C# compiler saying, I don't know what that is. And there's also a visual cue. You'll notice that objects that are recognized by the C# compiler are highlighted in a certain color, like the console object right here. Now, ordinarily, array list would be highlighted as well, and it's not. And that's your first clue that something is wrong, along with this giant red squiggle underneath it that gives you the error. It turns out that the problem is I have not included the right namespace in order to use array lists. So I have to scroll to the top of the file. And sure enough, I'm using the system.collections.generic namespace, but array lists are contained in the system.collections namespace. So I have to say using system.collections. And when I put that using statement in, you can see that the problem goes away. Let's scroll back down to where that code is. And you'll see now that the array list object is highlighted in light blue, the same way that the console is, which means that the C# compiler is recognizing it. All right, let's move on down to the next issue. I'm going to uncomment these lines of code right here. Going to save, and you see that we're getting a complaint that a curly brace is expected. The curly brace is actually expected way down at the end of the program. Well, clearly something is pretty wrong here. And if we scroll back up to where the error actually is, you'll notice that I've got my opening curly brace here and a closing curly brace here, and those seem to match up. You can see that when I put the cursor next to the curly brace, the IDE highlights the two braces to show me that they match. But the problem is that I've actually got an extra one all the way over here on the end of the for statement. And that's causing the compiler to think that all the rest of the code following that line is contained in an unclosed curly brace block. Once I get rid of that extra curly brace and I save and I hit F6, you can see that that error goes away. So the lesson here is indentation does not necessarily mean what blocks are. You have to put braces so they match each other. Just because you put one brace up here and another brace on another line down there does not mean that those make a block. You have to make sure that you have the same number of closing braces as you have opening braces. Otherwise, you're going to get weird errors like that. Let's move on to issue number 5. I'm going to uncomment this string right here. I'm going to save, and I'm going to get a nice big red squiggle. And it says down here in the error list, too many characters in character literal and cannot implicitly convert type char to string. What's going on here? I've got my quotes. I've got the string defined. The problem here is that you can't use single quotes to define a string in C#. You must use double quotes. The single quotes are for individual characters. And so you see that when I put the single quotes into double quotes, the error goes away. Now I'm getting another warning that says that that string's not used, but don't worry about that for now. Scroll down to the next issue. I'm going to uncomment these two lines. So I have an integer array of values, and it's called my array. 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we've got 5 items in the array, and then I'm trying to set the array item at index 2 to be 10. And I'm getting an error. It says my array is a variable, but it is used like a method. And the problem here is that you don't use parentheses to index into arrays. You use square brackets. Parentheses are used for calling functions. Brackets are used to index into arrays. And you can see that once I change the brackets, everything's fine. All right, let's go on to the next issue. I'm going to uncomment this call to console.writeLine, and then I get an error. It says system.console does not contain definition for writeLine. What are you talking about? Sure it does. I've been using writeLine throughout this course. There's a function there called writeLine. I know that there is. In fact, I used it probably up here earlier. Yep, see, there it is. And then I realized, oh, wait a minute. No, there's a capitalization problem in there. That actually has to be a capital L. That's because C# is a case-sensitive language. Case matters. This is something you'll run into probably at least once when you're writing your C# code. You need to make sure that the cases match. And that's true of variables. It's true of function names. It's true of almost any type of declaration that you make in C#. Let's move on to issue number 8. In issue number 8, I've got 3 lines of code. I've got an integer variable that's set to 2500. I've got a floating point variable that's set to 35.895. And then I'm trying to set the value of f into the value of I. Now I've got 2 different problems going on here. First, a local variable named I cannot be declared in this scope because it would give a different meaning to I, which is already used in a child scope to denote something else. That's a very, very long-winded way of saying, you know what, I've already used I somewhere else in this code block. So if I scroll back up, there it is. I've already used the I variable in this for loop, so it's not going to let me use it again down here. No problem. I'll just simply call this I1, and I'll call that one I1. Got another problem. The problem here is, let's look at the error list, cannot implicitly convert type float to int. An explicit conversion exists. Are you missing a cast? Yes, I am. Remember, you can't implicitly cast a variable that is of a larger size into a smaller size. You have to explicitly tell the compiler that you're doing that. So what I need to do to convert a float into an int, I have to put the word int in parentheses. And what this tells the compiler is, hey, compiler, treat that floating point number as if it were an integer, which will let me assign it to another variable that is of that same type, in this case, integer. And you can see when I put that cast in front of the f, everything goes away, and we're fine. Next issue, issue number 9, I'm going to uncomment these lines. I've got 2 integer variables, one named a and one named b. And then I've got an if statement. If a is equal to b, then we're going to write out, yep, they're equal numbers. And no sooner do I do that than, oops, I get an error. And it says, cannot implicitly convert type int to bool. What's the problem here? I'm not trying to convert anything to anything. Well, remember that inside if statements, what you're checking for is a Boolean condition. That's how the if statement knows to execute. And the problem here is that I'm not using double equal signs. I'm using the assignment operator, not the equality check operator. So once I change this to the equality check operator, the error goes away and everything's fine. One more issue that I want to show you, and you'll run into this, and sometimes it can be pretty confusing as to what's going on. I'm going to uncomment this entire function. I've got a function here called func, and it takes an integer variable, and if that integer parameter is greater than 0, then it returns 0. If that parameter is less than 0, it returns -1, but I'm getting an error. It says compileissues.program.func, not all code paths return a value. The problem here is that I've declared this function to return an integer value, and I'm returning an integer value here and returning an integer value here. But what happens if the parameter a is equal to 0? Well, there's no path in here that returns a number. I have to make sure that if my function is going to return a value, then all of the possible code paths that it can take have a return statement in there. There's a couple ways I could fix this. I could put in an if case for a is double equal to 0, but since that's the only case left, and the function would have returned by now if any other case had been encountered, I can just simply say return whatever else. I can say return 100, or I can return 1,000, or I can return whatever I want, as long as it is a valid return type. Those are 10 of the most common compilation issues that you'll probably run across in your C# coding. Next, we're going to take a look at how to use the debugger to look at code while it's running.